Reactive training systems.
All right, so we're going to do our Q&A. So just to kind of get things warmed up, we got some questions that floated in yesterday and kind of overnight and whatnot. So I want to start off with one of those and just kind of get your all's thoughts on this. What do you do in the weeks after a competition? So what do you recommend for an athlete to do in weeks after competition? Anybody want to jump in first?
It's my first time talking today. It's kind of fun. But you gotta, the client-coach relationship, I think, is really important here. Some people just want to get right back into heavy training. And if, as a coach, you're like, well, I don't ever do that for my lifters, that's another ego thing you kind of have to drop. And sometimes, yeah, you need to say, you've been training hard for 12 weeks, 15 weeks, 16 weeks. Like, you need a break. I know you really want to train, but it might lead to injury. You might be overusing your muscles, and it's just not a good idea. And you need to convince them a little bit of why training hard right after a meet isn't the best option. And so in that case, just convince them. But sometimes just go hard right again. You're ready. It's not a really important meet. You don't have another meet for a while, or you have a meet coming up right in 4 more weeks. So talking to the client is going to be really important, making a decision that makes sense for both of you. So if the client isn't frustrated, you're not frustrated, and the communication is there. It's pretty much like do whatever you think makes sense. It's not telling you what to do, but I think that's kind of the answer that I like.
Well, I think with the emerging strategies idea, it's actually really good because you have the long-term planning. So I know personally for me, what I do is go over my schedule for the year with Mike and say, like, this is when I'm going on vacation, or this is when we have something big coming up for like life events or whatever. And you can plan your programming because you know your time to peak, you know how long your restoration blocks are. So you can kind of plan your like big life events around your training schedule. So that's a benefit of the emerging strategy, I think. And then really it always ends up that it fits really well into my stress level too, in terms of like, I'm always like, I can't do it right now. So, and I like to take breaks after competition, and I find that a lot of people, especially if you're going hard for a long period of time, the longer you have been engaged in powerlifting. So we've talked a lot about like your training lifetime or your lifespan in training. I think the more rest that you're inclined to take, or just mental break after a big competition too, because there's a lot of internal stress or mental fatigue that goes into these like giant, like nationals or worlds for high level lifters. It's just so much stress that goes into the competition, and taking the time off allows you to kind of get your groove back or get your excitement back about getting back into hard training, because some people like lose that after. They're just like, I don't want to do it right now. So if you take a couple of weeks off or have light training for a few weeks, you're like, okay, I'm ready to go. So.
Not to completely disagree, like what Jim says, because I definitely agree with that. You got to listen to the lifter and get to know the lifter and what their needs are. But I think too, oftentimes that people that are so anxious to get right into the next cycle right after a meet are typically more young, inexperienced lifters, and that's when the coach kind of needs to, hey, let's pull the reins a little bit. We really need to slow down and take a break, especially if they've gone several competitions in a row now. It's just time to slow down a little bit, take a break, rejuvenate your mind, rejuvenate your body, and then we'll get back to work. You're not going to lose much, if anything at all, by a break. So yeah.
Oftentimes people actually, not often, but the few times that it happens is pretty cool, is you take a break and somehow the lifter keeps getting stronger. You're like, I wasn't expecting this. They're not expecting it. They think they're in like a new developmental block. And I'm like, no, that was a washout. And
Right before nationals, I had a washout and I hit like a PR5 on deadlift, and you're like, I thought you were in a restoration block. I was like, I thought so too, but what's happening here? I don't know. But yeah, they're fun because you don't go into training with so much mental. You should always be mentally focused when you're training, but you don't go in with like this expectations. Like this training session needs to be good because I have a competition in 2 weeks or in 3 weeks, and then you get pleasantly surprised by what happens. So.
Want to take a question?
With the emergent strategies, like system of writing programs, where do you see and how do you use like more GPP or unilateral loading or other types of assistance work like throughout the year and throughout your cycles to help work on your weak links or actually like get hypertrophy parts that might need to be worked on or things like that?
So a lot of that is going to fit into your pivot block. So there's a ton of different ways that you can do the pivot block. So the things that you want to keep in mind is you want to maintain your strength, reduce the intensity, reduce the overall stress. But other than that, you have a lot of flexibility. So just some quick ideas. And all these ideas don't have to get crammed into one pivot block. You can have different kinds and mix them up. Maybe you want to have some circuits in there, and so that can provide a cardiovascular or metabolic benefit. Or maybe one thing that everyone hates is 5-3-0 tempo work. So five counts down, a 3-second pause at the bottom, and then press up. You can do that with squats, benches, and deadlifts. Make sure everyone hates you. Right. But the idea for that is that you're helping to improve the elasticity of the tendons, and that's going to ideally help you prevent injuries and things like that as you go into future training blocks. Or you do movements that you otherwise wouldn't get to do. So if rows get shoehorned out of your program a lot of times because of time limitations, as they often do, that's a time for you to make up for that. Or unilateral work, or movement that's out of the sagittal plane, or just all kinds of different things. So you have lots of options, and to be honest, if you get a little creative with it, it can be kind of fun.
I was just going to kind of build on that. It's just kind of looking at the overall plan, long-term plan. What does the lifter need at that point? Is it a pivot block coming up to a meet, or is it a off-cycle pivot block? Would this person benefit from some hypertrophy work, or do they really need stuff that's just completely non-competition lift type stuff? So
I was going to add to the GPP stuff. One of the things I like to recommend, I personally don't specifically schedule a lot of GPP stuff, like to encourage the lifter to find some type of physical activity away from the gym and away from the barbell, and go out and do that 1 or 2 times a week instead of always being stuck in the gym. I think it provides a good mental stress break. You know, if you like to go hiking, go hike. If you like to go, I like snowboarding, so I do a lot of snowboarding in the winter as my GPP. I think it just provides a good mental break, and it can be fun. It doesn't always have to be work, and it gives a lot of good stuff for that general physical preparedness. So.
I have a coaching question, I guess. How would you explain to an athlete that you have their sort of programming written out, but they keep just like randomly pulling a heavy single and being like, hey, guess what I did? And like they just go for a 1 rep max sort of randomly. How do you get them to understand that's not a good idea? Or does it not matter?
You fire them. Well, you have to first, let's get to the heart. It's not about the programming. It's about your relationship with that athlete. And you have to figure out why they're not listening to you. And a lot of times it has nothing to do with you. It has to do with them. To me, if someone keeps pulling a heavy single, they're trying to continue to test their weight. And they're trying to make sure that they're getting strong. So they don't trust the process yet. So I think my approach for that would be to get them to settle down and just give you a week and then build from there. So then get them to trust the process, trust what's going on, and it gives you an opportunity to further communicate with them and just build that in. I think after a while they will settle down, or in all seriousness, it might not be a good fit, or maybe you just program a week of heavy singles and let them live with that.
So I definitely agree that it's a trust thing. So especially if they're a new client, they might not trust you. But using the training logs or something that tracks estimated 1RM, you can say, I understand that you're really excited, but let's try this way. But you can also see that you are making progress because your estimated 1RMs are showing up as X, Y, and Z over the course of these 4 weeks. So you can use your data on the lifter to say, hey, I know that you are really excited and want to know and make sure that you're getting stronger, but we are showing you that you're getting stronger because the data proves it. So hang on, and then in the next block, we might throw in some singles. But for now, hang on, kind of thing, but using your data.
Yeah, I agree with everything they just said, and just wanted to add that I give them have what I'll call the stress talk with them, which is basically, hey, if you want to do heavy singles, you're sacrificing other work that you could be doing and getting stronger, and that heavy single is just a test. You're not going to get strong. It's not a good way to get strong, is testing yourself constantly. You're just, causing yourself stress and not gaining much from it.
I also think one of the difficulties with when you get a lot of different lifters is some people are just not good at transferring their strength from a set of 5, set of 6, set of 7 to an estimated 1 or max, or to when you're actually testing, and the data is showing strength, but then once we get more intense, it doesn't match up with what the set of an 8 says their estimated 1 or max would be. And so that complicates this whole question, and so I apologize, but I agree also. So it makes it difficult. You got to figure out a way to figure out what metric actually applies to, yes, your estimated 1 rep max is truly improving, and that estimation is more accurate.
So going back to their 5 or 6 not lining up with the estimated 1RM. So 2 things. One, you can create a custom RPE chart, which will adjust those numbers, but in the absence of doing that, what you can do, and if you're a coach that pays attention to what your lifter is doing, even though the estimated 1RMs in your data sheet aren't correlating to what they're actually performing at when you test their 1RMs, but you know that. So over time, when you continue to test, you might see that, okay, so they're showing up 10% 10 pounds higher on their, around 10% higher on their estimated 1RMs, and then they're testing 10 pounds lower. So you know that, and you can say, okay, so this might not be accurate, but at least it's a consistent chart. So we have consistent data, and just take that note that, okay, when I'm planning for their competition or whatnot, that even though their estimated 1RM might be showing up in the like 370 range, they're going to perform in that like 360 range, just because you as a coach have paid attention to their performance relative to their estimated performance. So it's consistency versus accuracy.
The other thing to add to that too is that it is an estimate. So you have to take that into consideration, that it's an estimate, and the main point of tracking that estimated 1RM is to watch for the trend, and if the trend is increasing, then we are improving. So watching and being cognizant of the trend and not so hyper focused on the number can be pretty important as well.
I'm intrigued by the time to peak concept. At how stable you kind of, the idea I got is that you define it as pretty stable for each lifter. But how long does it take then to reach that stable estimate of time to peak? Because I can think of stress that's not necessarily coming from training. It could, we're not washing machines, I agree, but it could come from things that we don't track in our log. And we don't track on the track app either, right? And also the time to peak could, as you mentioned with the slots for each lift, it could be affected by the program itself, the mini cycle.
So the time to peak doesn't seem to be anchored so much to the stress of the cycle. It seems to be more closely tied to the number of exposures to that stimulus. So if you have a lot of life stresses, I don't normally, unless it gets ridiculous, I don't normally see that affecting time to peak, but it could affect how high that peak becomes. Does that answer your question? I don't think that.
Just in a little bit more detail, if you start working with someone and you run the first A/B kind of thing, how and you run it for the first time and you see, okay, are you really sure that that's going to be always 6 weeks, or you would run it a couple more times to then claim that, okay, this is the 6 week?
I would continue to pay attention for basically ever. Now, normally that first cycle is pretty good. That's pretty reliable. Occasionally, that first cycle is a bit of an anomaly, and maybe the second cycle is a bit better. But it usually doesn't take too long, and they've settled down. But so a lifter peaks in 6 weeks. You give them a different training cycle, even if it's the same frequency. It could be 7, it could be 5. So again, we're not to the tune of not being washing machines. It's not perfectly predictable, but you're in the range. So continue to pay attention and just be tuned in and alert. So if they're, if they normally peak in 6 and they set a PR on that week and they feel great, and you're thinking, let's see what happens if we let it go another week, then that's a fine thing to do, as long as you're communicating that and everything, and you know that it might not be a great idea, but we could at least go and see, because again, that peak condition is rare and valuable. So don't flinch too early.
Also, in the presentation, Mike talked about the squat. I think the squat peaked a little early for one lifter, and then the bench and deadlift peaked consistently. Understanding how kind of the peak works can change how, for example, a meet is probably when this is really important. How do we get them all peaking at the same time? I think he talked a little bit about it too, but how we can have a maintenance block for one lift and then let the other two peak. And I actually just did that with a lifter, and it was pretty successful. So there's ways around it that there's a lot more to talk about regarding the emerging strategy. So knowing that is important.
Yeah, I would say pay attention, keep it real simple. So you don't want to. You're not going to try to get someone's peak down to like the minute that they're peaking, and you're not trying to optimize that. And there are times where I've had a lifter that I'm running on emerging strategy, and if they're under extreme duress and say school finals so and so, I might pull them a week early, and that's just goes back to paying attention. So you're listening. They're listening to themselves. They understand what they're doing. They're communicating with you, and you're communicating with them, and say, look, it's not worth it to push. The return is not going to be there. So let's pull you a week early. We'll just add an extra week of maintenance, let you get through your finals or whatever they are, and then continue on. And in the long run, it's not going to matter, and it's probably going to be beneficial for that lifter because they'll be more focused and they'll be happier. So.
The other thing too that I've seen personally with quite a few of my lifters in time to peak is that if their initial time to peak in that first development block is inaccurate, it's usually long. So say it'll go for like 8 weeks, and then you get into the next development block and you go to run it, and you come to find that they only run 6 weeks, and their actual accurate time to peak is only 6 weeks. So that's why that exists. I don't know either, but it comes in handy. And that's also to say that maybe at some point in time in the future too, if they're peaking at 6 weeks, maybe you do want to investigate further. If they're feeling good and they're not overstressed, then maybe you investigate further again. But typically it's inaccurate on the long end and it gets shorter on the second bout.
So sometimes exercise variation and more volume is going to create a lot of soreness. And if you need to go back to the gym quickly, let's say you can run 2 days in a row. I know sleep plays a role in that, nutrition, proper nutrition, but what about things that you can do actively to recover faster for the next session? What can you do?
Yeah, I mean, you can do active recovery or passive recovery too. One of the things that I really enjoy that seem to help me a lot is some Epsom salt baths if I get excessively sore. That's been working and treating me well pretty well lately.
So one of the things that is really good with RPE is that because we are using RPE to determine the loads based on how we feel that day, you can adjust the loads for however much soreness you have. I always like active recovery a lot better than passive, but the Epsom salt bath is a really good passive recovery method. Now, if you are coming off of like a restoration block or going into a restoration block that's like high volume and you're coming off of low volume, then you're going to be more sore because you're not adapted to high volume. Now, after a few weeks, 2, 3, probably just 3 weeks at most of high volume, if you're not adapting and you're continually sore, there's something going on in either the programming or systemically. So you're going to want to look at both of those. If you're like always sore, not recovering, always fatigued, it's programming or systemic. So first talk to your coach, adjust things, and then if you adjust things and you're still overly sore, overly fatigued, then I would say see the doctor.
Any other question? Well, I have the mic. Can I do one more? So yesterday in the nutrition talk, I thought it was very interesting, but one thing that sometimes you can't afford to have is like the long bulk or a long cutting phase. So can you talk a little bit about the mini cuts or mini bulks?
Aren't we in constant bulk mode?
Yes, as powerlifters, bulking is life, and so this is a question I didn't hope you would ask because I don't typically like mini cuts or mini bulks. I think if you're doing what I kind of talked about in the last seminar of like making sure the decisions that you're making are logical and you're thinking long term, which obviously not everyone's going to be able to do all the time. If you're doing that, hopefully we don't need mini bulks, mini cuts, because I think it mentally it's weird. Like a 2-week mini cut, how much weight are you really going to lose? Like 4 pounds, and then you're going to gain it back in a few months. You almost also have to accept you're gonna gain some fat. Like, it's not that you do this slow, long bulk and no fat is gained and it's just muscle. Like, there's gonna be some fat gained even if you're doing it right. A lot of people are afraid of that. It's difficult. I can say don't be afraid of fat. That's a really personal thing. But you can't. You got to work on like how the fat gain is affecting you. Trying to let that go, accepting the new version of you. You're not gonna be the lighter version of you anymore. If you're making this decision, it's gonna make you a better powerlifter. But if you do it in the way I talked about, hopefully we can minimize the additional gain in fat if that's something you don't like about the growth. But accepting it is really important. Trying to get back to the reality of your previous self is in any context is going to be really detrimental for the long term. A mini bulk, I don't really see the point of that at all. What decision would, I mean, I just don't understand, like a 3-week bulk, like you're not going to gain anything really of value in 3 weeks. So that means almost always bulking should be kind of a long-term thing, and other people might have a different opinion, but.
So not from a nutrition point of view, but from a coaching point of view, why? Why are you saying that you don't have to, if you don't have time to do it, then don't do it. Plan for it and take the time to do it. And it doesn't, so it works for me as a hypothetical question, but practical application is not there. Say that again?
Like, let's say you are cutting out 18 weeks. How long do you need to stabilize and then your body?
Yeah, actually, that's something I didn't get to talk about a lot in my last.
Repeat it for the internet.
Yeah, okay. Question is, what about like a stabilization or maintenance phase of your diet? And I think that's something I didn't get to talk a lot about, but it's really important. Like, it's not like you're going to be bulking or cutting for your whole life. Sometime you're just going to be cool with where you're at. And so maybe in the long term, if you're, no, maybe not. Ideally, you're like, cool, I like this. This is fine forever. But that doesn't happen a lot. But if you have made the decision that you want to get to 93 and you got there, then applying all of the baseline stuff, it's all you really need to focus on, right? That's why the habit is important, because after the habit is built, if you're tracking your food intake for a year, 6 months, for me, I think I tracked almost every day for 2 years. I don't recommend that for most people, because it's so much information all the time, and then you're afraid, what happens when I stop tracking? What's going to happen to my body? I don't have any control anymore. So letting go of that control, I think, is really difficult for a lot of people. But again, you kind of have to, you can ease into it. Maybe now you only track your calories. Maybe now you only track protein and calories. Instead of tracking everything all the time, you slowly back off on the control, and it allows you to adapt a little bit better. Another thing is tracking your weight out every day, especially in a cut, especially kind of in that bodybuilding mindset. That can be really stressful. So maybe instead of tracking every day, you track twice a week, 3 times a week, something slower. That way you're not losing all of control all at once. And you're kind of adapting to that new version of you with a little bit less control. But hopefully it allows for a lot more satisfaction with yourself and that new version that you've developed, because you don't always need to be tracking everything all the time, as much as we're kind of a data-driven company, You don't always need to track everything, but when it matters, when you have this goal, you want to gain weight, yes, you need to. If you're not tracking, then why is that the goal? Because you're not even paying attention. If you
you might have said this, like, be honest with yourself. You know, like, you might think that you're accurate with your caloric representation, but you might be taking a bite or a scoop of peanut butter, and that's a lot of calories. And then as you start to add the calories back in, you're more compliant because you're not as hungry, and then the weight kind of starts to or continues to come off. But you also stay in a caloric deficit for a few more weeks while you're slowly increasing. So you'll see a drop and then maybe like a little spike. So.
Yeah, so in the middle of that, the sound died. I was frantically changing batteries, but I'm going to go to a question from the internet now. John Garfano, who's been with us all mornings, asks, really for the panel, what is the number one thing you've learned in your coaching practice in the last year?
Listen to your clients. Pay attention.
Yeah, I'd say pretty much the same thing. And what I said yesterday about listening to the client's intuition about things, and then my own intuition as well. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
So I guess we're all going to say pay attention. So, so I mean, it's not a new lesson, but it's a lesson, I guess, that gets persistently highlighted. You know, it's something that shows up again and again, that if you're paying attention, if you're doing your homework, if you're looking at that type of thing, then you get better results. That happened for me personally on my bench press. You know, since that's the comp lift that I'm training now with the most effort, I'm able to devote more attention to it, and that's being rewarded. So I think that's a lesson that's generalizable to pretty much everything.
This is a bit more of like the why why people are now saying, well, we were listening to the clients. And I think obviously we always have been, but paying really close attention and kind of letting go of what we want to do with the lifter because of our individual preferences for how we would like to have them train. And a lot of that just goes back to ego and letting go of it, and just, this is what the lifter's doing and this is what's happening. So it doesn't matter what I want for this lifter. What do they respond to? And that's probably the reason too.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have to agree with all these guys, only maybe a little bit different spin, you know, maybe label it more as general communication and not just listening to the lifter, but also trying to articulate myself in a more clear and concise manner in what I'm trying to do and what their expectations are, so that we can kind of bridge that gap and realize that at the end of the day, you know, we're a team. Even though it's an individual sport, the coach-athlete relationship needs to develop so that we're a team and we can move forward, and that's really going to be huge in progressing the lifts.
So this is what happens when I go last and everybody said the same thing. So, but what I've noticed is, for me, is the amount of actual collaboration that goes into building a relationship and developing and maintaining that relationship with the lifters. They're people too. So, yeah, and we have to remember that. Yes, as long as they listen to me and do everything that I tell them, then we have a good collaborative relationship. But it really is. There's a lot of listening, because ultimately we want our success is predicated on their success. So if they're not successful, if they're not happy, then we're, at the end of the day, we're not doing our jobs. So our job is to ultimately make the lifters happy.
So one last thing that I wanted to add, and this isn't necessarily what I've learned in the last year, but this is just something that I always pay attention to or remind myself of, is that I might have goals for the lifter. Like, I want them to get stronger. I might want them to compete, but at the end of the day, it's what the client or the lifter wants. So if their goal is to just get strong and just stay pain-free and just be happy in the gym and have fun and go in and have good training sessions every time, and they don't have the desire to compete right now, then that's not their goal right now. And you as a coach have to remember that while you are a powerlifting coach or you're a bodybuilding coach, the lifter doesn't always have that same goal in mind. So it's the lifter, the client's goal, and not necessarily just your goal. So you want to take into account their goals. Just always check in with them and make sure that their goals and your goals are aligned.
Yeah, especially because they're always changing.
Yeah, always changing. So.
Okay, so this is more on the emerging strategy. How do you convey emerging strategies as a coach to your lifter if he expects something like periodization model or at least week-to-week changes in the programming?
Well, I have a document actually where I've written about it. Just kind of the broad strokes of what it's all about, what you can expect, and why we're doing it, and honestly, some stories about how this has really made a difference for some lifters. People relate to that. People relate to the stories and stuff like that, and that helps with the buy-in. And that helps us to get started, And that's always the biggest hurdle, I think, with emerging strategies is getting your foot in the door. Because once you've got the athlete to commit to doing a development cycle, that first development cycle, we were talking at the break, as far as is emerging strategies more for long-term or short-term? Well, when you think about it, principally it's more for long-term development, but we also kind of see this really great bounce for the first development cycle. We were talking at the break that's more the rule than the exception in our experience, and I can't really explain why that would be. But so if you can get somebody to commit to doing a development cycle and they do it and they set this enormous PR total, they're bought into it now, and you can get that commitment a bit longer. So it's just kind of good communication, explaining to them what to expect, why we're doing it, and just what they can expect going forward. We've got some questions out here too.
So this goes back to yesterday, kind of. I noticed with the survey you did, all the lifters that actually qualified generally seem to be fairly low in neuroticism. And I'm thinking that it's not necessarily that it's just people low in neuroticism who are powerlifting. I think people who are high in neuroticism are probably not competing due to like fear and anxiety that tends to come along with that. What advice would you have for people who might be high in neuroticism, fear, anxiety around competing? How would you advise them to begin competing?
So who wants them to compete?
Like
you or them? So that's the first question.
Both. I see a lot of people who they want to compete, but they don't want to compete. Like they want to, but they're scared to. They're still practicing the lifts, but they...
Sure. Well, then a couple things. I mean, so I can tell you from experience here that we'll put on a practice meet. We'll do a mock meet, and we'll do a mock meet where the rest of the gym is there to support. So they're the audience, and they're everybody's bought in, and so it shows the lifter who's got that high neuroticism that it's okay, right? They do this, and then the endorphins kick in, and the neuroticism goes down a little bit, and they're like, I could see myself doing this. I could do it. Some lifters are like, I'm never going. Like I've had over the years, not a lot, but a couple lifters who have done a meet, and I've never seen them again because it was just too much for them, or whatever it is, or they decided that this is not my thing, and that's okay too. They've come to a decision point, and they've be a weightlifter, go to CrossFit, whatever it is, that's their thing. But I would say just kind of think about boiling a frog, right? Just do it, bring the temperature up gradually, and if that's something that they want, and again, go back to paying attention, just listening to your lifter, and the testing goes a long way, and putting them in a positive, supportive environment goes a long way as well.
It's mine. And I'd like to think, to go back to my presentation as well, and using your mind, is examine it. What is the fear born of, right? Oftentimes, I think situations like that, when somebody is in fear of going out to compete or going to a powerlifting meet, They're fearing things that don't actually exist and that are not real, and they're fearing that they're going to have a bad time because, they're not the strongest lifter in the room. Well, sure, like we compete in powerlifting, and that's part of the competition. That's also not part of the point at all, especially in that first meet. The first meet is all about going out and having that experience. And oftentimes when you get there and you have that first experience and you get into your first meet, you're going to find out that the community is probably one of the most supportive communities that you'll ever be. And that person that you're competing with and competing against is right there yelling for you to hit that PR on the platform. And that support and that uplifting community can really help squash any of those fears that you had a misunderstanding of in the first place.
So I work with a lot of people in person, and specifically women, and I have some women who are on the fence about competing. And, I think that what I like to do is try and get them to set up their training, or I do it like on my own without them knowing, set up their training sessions like back to back so they can meet other women that are similar to them and have gone through their first like local competition. Or I try also not to use the word competition and say just meet, because competition sounds competitive to win, where a meet you just go and do what you're there to do on that day. So how are you talking to them about it? And setting up their training sessions so that they meet each other, can share experiences. Oh, so-and-so just did this competition a few weeks ago and she had so much fun, she's signing up for another one. That sparks a conversation. They talk about the experiences, and so she's like, oh, maybe it's fun, maybe I'll do it. I also talk about my own first experience with powerlifting competition and how much fun I had and how it's led me to this life that I absolutely love. I have such a great social network. Again, meeting these people at competitions is just so much fun. There's so much support. So you want to talk about your own experiences also. And then finding a competition that's low stress. So it doesn't need to be like Mid-Atlantic or a regional competition. Find a local competition. For my females, there's a local competition, Iron Maidens. It's all women. They don't wear singlet. They just come in their training clothing and they do the competition. That gets them excited. There's so much social support. There's women supporting them, and they've had a really fantastic experience for their first time, and it's low stress. So talking to them about a low stress environment or situation. And then they're like, well, I want to do Paulie's meet next time. So then I have them all come to this one. And together, you're there, I'm there supporting them, their team is there supporting them. So building that social network for the lifter in training, at a competition, and with you, giving them a nice piece of support. Just go this way.
Oh, just real quick. I think it really helps to kind of back away from the whole thing and just put things in perspective. We're competing for fun. That's what it is at the bottom line. We're not competing for money or anything else. So if you can kind of put things in perspective with the rest of your life or their life, nobody's going to die, probably. Nobody's going to get hurt. They probably have gone through much, much, much worse experiences. And it's really in their mind, whether they make it, like Alexiev said, a torture or a carnival. It's entirely in their head. So that's, if you put things in that perspective and think that, hey, if the meet's on Saturday night, that's it. I'm done. My chance to have fun at the meet is now over. So better make sure you have fun while you're there.
I think the other thing is, as coaches, it seems like we forget where we all started. Personally, I first started training in like my basement in my house, and then once I could drive, I drove to the first gym that was available to me, which was not my parents' like commercial gym. And I started really liking competing, or not competing, but lifting. I just loved that process, and I know I love lifting. But I didn't have any community. I mean, the commercial gyms, how many powerlifters do you know at commercial gyms? And then you see this experience, and it seems like from the outside, you're just looking at this like crazy experience, and you're like, how do I get in? I don't know. This seems nerve-wracking. And then maybe the option for you is to first, before even thinking about competing, is do you have any local gyms or gyms nearby, or even a 40-minute drive might be the way to get into this sport without jumping right into a meet. For me, that was what the option was. There weren't any super close gyms. It was the 35-minute drive. But the value I got from joining a powerlifting focused or even bodybuilding oriented gym was insane. Like, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that decision. So taking like a bunch of steps back and just thinking like, how did I even get into the competition mindset itself, was that I joined a powerlifting gym. And, you know, all of these awesome people have probably had similar experiences where they found the community first, or maybe they didn't, but that was how it was for me, and I find that to be incredibly valuable.
We'll take one more question.
Just while we're waiting, my solution was to start a powerlifting gym. So you can do that also.
All set? All right. Well, we'll take a break there. Thanks everyone for watching on the live stream. Thanks everyone for hanging out with us. We're going to take a break now for lunch, and we'll be back for training afterwards. So it's 12:08, so 1:30. Thanks.
Reactive training systems.